Hello there. I am glad you can make it today. We are in the book of First Samuel, starting in chapter 21. Now, you may recall from the previous lesson that at this point, David has been targeted by King Saul. King Saul wants to kill David, really for no good reason. But in Saul's mind, David is a threat to become the next king, and in order to become the next king, Saul has to be pushed out of the way. So Saul is after David and anyone who helps him. Well, David has just made his escape from the immediate area, and he goes down to a town called Nob. Now, in Nob, what you had was a city of priests. So there were a lot of priests there. There were a lot of religious ceremonies that would take place there, and it's possible that the Ark of the Covenant was there, although it's not mentioned at this time. So David goes there, and he asks the priest there, the main priest there, for bread and any weapons. And this priest gives David some of the bread that had been offered to God, but um, was no longer part of that ceremony for being given to God. So really, he wasn't supposed to give that bread to him, but David was hungry, and this priest wanted to help out. Now, as far as weapons, the only thing they had there was the sword of Goliath. And you may remember that David had killed the giant Goliath and taken his sword. So this is where the sword ended up. And that's the only weapon he's got. But he gives that to David. And David leaves. Well, this may have turned out to be okay, except there was this guy there who wasn't even a Jewish person. He was an Edomite, and he worked for Saul, and he saw what was going on. Well, he reports this to Saul. Saul has done some investigating, and he finds out what has happened, and as a result, he starts killing everybody in this town. So it's all of the priests and their wives and their children. So we can see here that Saul is just as bad as any of the kings who had been around Israel, and he's killing his own people. Now, one of those priests gets away, and he begins searching for David. Meanwhile, David has gone to Gath, and that shows how desperate he was, because Gath is a Philistine town, and Gath is where Goliath had come from. But apparently, David was there to offer his services as a fighter to the king of that town. And it may have gone over well, except a bunch of people there recognized David. And they're saying, hey, wait, we know who this guy is. Well, David apparently gets scared from this, and he starts acting like he's crazy. And to us, that might not seem to make much sense, but in that time, and really up until fairly recently, when someone was crazy, a lot of people would think, oh, that's the touch of God on him, and so we better not mess with him. So if people had an evil spirit, or if they were just crazy naturally, uh, then everybody else would leave them alone. And as long as that person wasn't in immediate danger, they wouldn't do anything. Well, uh, this seems to be what happens in Gath, and so David ends up leaving. He goes to where his family is, and they live in Bethlehem, if you remember, and he sees that Saul is a threat, not just to David, but to his own family. So he gathers them up, his brothers and his parents, and he goes to Moab and asks the king there if he will take care of them until David can come back. And you think, why go to Moab? But you have to remember, back in the book of Ruth, we find out that Ruth is from Moab, and some of David's ancestors live there. And in fact, Ruth is David's great grandmother. Now, she has died by this time, but people took family connections seriously, and they would have seen David and his family as being descended from the Moabites. So they were inclined to be friendly with them as long as it didn't cause any trouble. So David is able to leave his family there. Well, they're taken care of. But then there's something else. While David had been in Bethlehem, there were a number of men who were troubled for one reason or another. They either had some kind of family problems or problems with the government, or didn't like Saul, or they just didn't fit in some way or another, and they were drawn to David. Now, David had these leadership qualities, and so people would want to follow him and want his approval and want to do things for him. And so he got together 400 men as a result. And so he had a sizable military force. Well, this eventually grows to 600 men, and that's a pretty good group of guys to have around. Well, David hears that Philistines are raiding a town in Judah, and he goes there with his men and fights them off. And the townspeople are grateful, but not completely grateful, because Saul hears about this since they're back in Judah, and he sends his army out after David. Well, at this town, the priest who had gotten away from the massacre at Nob, I think his name is Abiathar, shows up, and he becomes the priest working with David through all of this, and he is able to make inquiries to God, and they hear that Saul is coming. Now, Saul's got 3,000 soldiers, so his best soldiers, so he's still 5 men to 1 against David, and David is in a city that has a wall and gates, so you'd think he would be safe. And David has the priest ask God, okay, will the people in this town turn me over to Saul? And God tells him twice, God tells him, yes, they will. So David leaves. Saul is now after David. Now, during all of this time, David's on the move, but at some point, Jonathan finds where David is, and so they are actually able to be together one more time. And Jonathan shows his support for David and says, David, I know you're going to be the next king, and I'm backing you up. I'm there with you. And so what we find out is that after all that, what they thought was their last meeting wasn't really their last meeting, even though this was a difficult time for them. Well, Jonathan leaves. David is again on the run, because each time he gets to a place, Saul will find out from somebody that David is there, and he'll send his army after David. And there are two occasions in particular where interesting things happen, and one of them is that David's men are on one side of a mountain, and Saul is coming around the other side of the mountain, and it looks like David is about to get caught. But Saul gets word that Philistines have raided another area, and so he pulls his army back to go and fight that. And so we know from this that, okay, God set this up to happen to save David. And then there's another occasion, and this one has a lot of kind of odd things in it. Saul starts coming after David again, and he stops his army at some place, and Saul has to go to the bathroom, and he goes into a cave. What Saul doesn't know is that inside the cave, David and all of his men have hidden. And so they're looking at it like, hey, David, you can finally kill this guy and be done with him. And David's not going to do it because he's still thinking that, okay, this is God's anointed. And through this, David has been a little deceptive with people all along. And, he's not wanting to be a bad guy. Some of these things may have been necessary for him to stay alive, but he doesn't want to be a bad guy. And he's going, I'm not going to be the one to kill the king. However, what he does do is slip up to where Saul is and cut off the corner of Saul's robe and takes it back with him. Well, David starts feeling pretty badly after this. And then Saul leaves, and David's going, I really shouldn't have done that. That was wrong for me to do. Well, Saul is headed away with his army, and David and his men come out, and David calls to Saul, and he's saying, I know you think I'm a wicked person, but I just had the opportunity to kill you, and I didn't do it. And he shows the corner of the robe, and he is bowed down to Saul and says, you're God's anointed. I'm not against you. And Saul realizes that David is not his enemy. And Saul has a change of heart. And, he calls David my son. He shows that affection toward David. And Saul takes his army and leaves. Now, Saul will not stay this way. And that's the tragedy of Saul, is that he does these bad things, and sometimes he'll turn away from them, but eventually he goes back to the bad things that he's doing and continues them. And that's ultimately what leads to his downfall. David takes his men and goes in another direction, and David wants no confrontation, but he does have 600 men who can fight with him, and so he's going to turn that into a force for good in the area. Now, I'm going to close the story at this point, so we see some calm that is occurring between David and Saul. So things are okay right now. They're not perfect, but they're okay for now. The main thing in all of this that we want to learn is that even though David has opportunities to turn bad and to do things that would make life easier for himself, even though sometimes he stumbles and commits sin, he does not want to willingly step into sin and to pursue it. And that's a lesson we can learn from him on that. All right, my tie today, you see these eyes? That's to represent David inside the cave, and it's dark, and he's trying to decide, has what he done been the right thing? To which ultimately, of course, he decides it isn't. Okay, with that, I'll let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.